And that is you have a list or an array, and you map over it, rendering some results to the screen, and React gives you this warning in the console that's like, hey, yo, bozo, like, come on, why didn't you specify a key? And you're like, a key? What the heck is a key? Oh, I think I remember seeing something about this. And so you go learn about it, and you're like, I don't know, what do I use as a key? And so, like most beginners I've worked with, the first thing they do is come across, I don't know, some old post, or just come across the idea of like, oh, I'll use the index. So they index into this array, and use that as the key. And oh, hey, the warning went away. Of course, if you know more about React, this is not what you're supposed to do. But I set out to also find that out. What happens if you don't include a key? What happens if you use a bad key? What if you use the index? What if you use something else? What if you use a random number every single time? What happens? And what is it really, so what are the consequences of this? So I jumped in and I just started messing around with it. I didn't have a key, and I was like, all right, what happens if we don't have a key? And at first, it seemed like everything was perfectly fine. I didn't notice anything unusual going on. My program seemed to work. I was just rendering a list of divs and child content. Well, okay, so I was rendering a list of React components, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to see, like, oh, is there some issue where if I don't specify a key, it messes up rendering out another React component as a child or something like that? And at first, it all seemed to work. And so I was like, okay, all right, interesting. But I know from knowing how React works internally that the key is actually important because of the DOM element that React is associating with the rendered output of your component. So a real quick, super quick version of how React renders: it executes your function or your component of any kind, class or function component, and that returns essentially a tree. You can think of it like your JSX output as a tree of elements. And it does that for your entire application. It goes through and executes all this code, and it ends up with this tree of divs and spans and whatever they might be. And then it does reconciliation, which is, hey, let's figure out how to connect this output, this tree, to what's on the screen currently. And if there's any differences, I need to update what's on the screen, the state on the screen, to match the output of your components. And so I know that the significance of the key in React is actually to help React figure out which DOM elements on the screen need to be associated with the output, this tree that you've output from your components. And so I wasn't that surprised when it all at first seemed to work. And so what I did next was I sort of instrumented the code. I added refs. So I won't go into what refs mean at this point. It's not relevant to this. But essentially, I attached refs to the output of the components that I was rendering in this list. And then I was logging out the DOM element associated with those refs. So essentially, what I was doing was telling React, hey, tell me which DOM element on the screen is actually associated with the output from my tree. And I was doing this because I wanted to see how, like, what React was doing internally, how it was working. And sure enough, and I started figuring some things out. So if I don't specify a key, what React does is every time it renders your component, it reuses the DOM element. So let's say I have a list of 5 things, and I'm rendering 5 things from my list to the screen. Let's say I'm rendering list item component, whatever it might be. I'm rendering 5 of them, and they each have different child whatever. It can be whatever content you want to render, right? And if I don't specify a key, what React is going to do is it's still going to go and render all of your list item components that are in your list every single time, no matter what. One of the first rules of React is it always renders everything. So it goes through, it maps over your array, it renders each component, and then so that all works perfectly fine. Like, you can do whatever you want. That's all solid. You don't have to worry. That all works great. And so I had it like generating a random number or doing a sequence and stuff like this, so I could see, oh, is this updating correctly to the screen? And for the child components that I was passing in, it was. And I was like, oh, it's all working. But then with these refs, I was able to see that it was reusing the DOM element for each of these list items. And so I was like, interesting. I wonder what happens if my list item component itself returns different output. And so I just created this scenario where every other time my list item component renders, it returns different output. So the first time it renders a div, the second time it renders a span, then a div, then a span, then a div, then a span. Just alternates back and forth every time I trigger a render. And then I was passing in the child element, right? The child value. And sure enough, guess what? It never rendered my spans. So I started it out rendering divs. It never rendered the spans. So, okay, sorry. Let me be very specific. It executed my component and rendered the span into this tree. So I could look at that and I could see, yes, it is running my code. It executed my list item component every time, and it's correctly detecting, okay, I need to render a span this time. But internally, when React went to update the DOM, it just ignored that. It was like, oh yeah, it's a span on screen as a div. I should be updating this, but it just ignores that. It updates the child, the children, whatever you're passing in, that gets updated, but it's not changing any of the output from your list item. And so this was, knowing how React works, not super unexpected to me. It was basically like, yeah, this is what's happening. So to answer the question of what happens if you don't specify a key, well, you could get some weird behavior. And depending on how your application works, it might actually be perfectly fine. Like if you're rendering a static list and the components that you're rendering render the same markup every time, it'll actually work perfectly fine. There'll be no bugs. But then somebody comes in a year later and their boss says, hey, add this feature to it. And then they extend your component and have it render different output sometimes. And now they'll be like, oh, why is this not working sometimes? So you definitely want to include a key. If you don't include a key, you're going to run into problems. So the next thing was, all right, we know that you want to include a key, and we know what that actually means. That means React will be able to associate the output from rendering this list to the DOM elements that it shows on the screen. So sort of going beyond that, what if I thought, what if I just give it a key, but give it a new key value every single time? And so I for the key, I use math.random. So every single time I render, I should get a new key. Now that we know how React is working internally, what we should be thinking is, okay, this should tell React create a new DOM element every single time instead of reusing the one that's on the screen. But I wanted to verify that, so I set up refs and some other things, and yeah, sure enough, if you use a different key value every single time your list renders, you're going to get a different DOM element. This means that React is going to tear down the old DOM element and put up a new one every single time. And I think this really gets into why React added this key property to begin with, why it exists at all. And it's a performance optimization. That's all it is. So to be honest, all right, I'm going to go into my thoughts about this a little later on. I'm trying to jump ahead here. I got some opinions on React doing this. But before we get into that, so yes, if you use math.random or some new value for your key every single time, what you'll find is that your program always works perfectly correctly. There should be no bugs. Everything works fine. As far as I can tell, this is perfectly legitimate behavior. Your program should work absolutely fantastic, other than you maybe have a performance problem. And I am not saying that sarcastically. I'm saying realistically, you probably won't even have a performance problem unless you're rendering a massive list. So, but we're gonna keep going. We're gonna keep pushing this thing. So what if I do the classic thing, which is pass in a list index for my key? And at this point, it's probably not surprising, but what's going to happen is it, again, might work correctly depending on your program, but depending on your program now or how it gets modified in the future, that may not always be the case. You could definitely get bugs here because, again, React is going to try to reuse the DOM element on the screen, maybe when it shouldn't be. So don't use list index. Okay, so technically you could use the list index, and I have used the list index, but I've used that when the index is stable and always going to be associated with the list I'm passing in, and I don't think anyone's ever going to come in and change how that works. Like, it wouldn't make sense. So sometimes if I have like a small list of static data that I've hard coded into the program, into that component essentially, then using the list index might be fine. But we're going to get into what your key should be in a little bit here. So I do want to, I forgot about this, but when I was talking about using math.random as the key, I did notice some interesting behavior that did surprise me that I don't understand. So, what I noticed is if I use a random key, it caused my components to re-render more. I actually don't know how to, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to explain it. But what I noticed is that if key equals math.random, React was doing excessive re-renders. Like, it was just re-rendering like almost constantly. And so the behavior of your program would be correct, but you'd get a bunch of extra renders, which would be terrible for performance, much worse than other potential bugs in your keys when it comes to performance. And so I was like, oh, that's weird. Does this happen for other props? Like, if I use math.random for other props, does that also cause a problem? No. I tried a whole bunch of props, valid props for my component, ones that didn't exist for my component. It didn't matter. If I used math.random, it had no effect on React re-rendering. But for some reason, if you use math.random as the key, React behaves very strangely. I would love to understand. If you know why this is, definitely let me know. But I didn't look too hard because I didn't have great internet at the time. But I might do some more research, maybe dive into the code, because this was fascinating behavior. So don't use math.random. Anyways, so